All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the KTG podcast, Honest Conversations, where the mission of my podcast is for all of us to really realize that, hey, we have greatness inside of us, and how can we be greater? And really important, how can we take this greatness and bring it to the world by emotionally resonating and having a brand that works for us? And I do this podcast for two reasons, as I always say. One, I care about humanity deeply and want professionals to see how we can be happier and produce great results for our community. And hey, I learn just like you do from my guests because I have the same struggles that you do. Some days it's good, some days it's ugly. And this is how we learn and grow together. So you're in for another treat because today is part 2 of my conversation with Juan Zuniga. He is managing partner of Rimon Law. And if you haven't heard our part 1 conversation, I urge you to go to that podcast. We'll drop the link in the show notes. Welcome, Juan. Happy to have you back, and thank you for making time again for me.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much for having me again. Last time was pretty fun, so I'm glad to do it again and as many times as you need.
I love it. I love it when you call it fun, because that's my hope. Because if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. So I really thank you. And I know you're super busy. I don't discount the fact that how busy you are. So thanks for making time and saying it was fun. I appreciate it. So in the interest of time, because I want to cover a whole different aspect of the practice today, I'm going to summarize what we talked about last time. And for those of you who want the whole story, which you really should listen to, including Juan's origin story, go to the podcast first episode. So we talked about your background and your story, how you come from a Scottish and a Hispanic Mexican background, which is fascinating to me, and how you supported your dad when he was running a small business. And that's how you really realized that's how you wanted to be a contribution to the community. Your path was Harvard undergrad and then Harvard Law. And in between there is when you worked for your father. And when you left Harvard Law, as we all know, they condition you for big law practice. And you went into big law wanting a cross-border practice that harmonized with your identity, which I thought was the most beautiful part of what you said. And along with a lot of other people, you discovered there was frustrations with how big law retains lawyers and how they run things. And so you left after 15 years. And as you were honest about it, you were unhappy. You launched your own practice. And then you went over to Rimon, and you've been there for over a decade now. And we talked about how, and this is why I wanted to do part 2, how the firm structure allows people to be autonomous in their practice from an economic perspective and from a collaboration perspective, or maybe that has nothing to do with autonomy, but I tend to think it does. And how it's not about dictating pricing and billable requirements. There are no billable requirements at your firm, if I remember correctly. And we talked about the distinction a little bit, but I want to flesh all this out today. That, well, we know big law doesn't really trust lawyers because otherwise they wouldn't be controlling so much of the billable requirements and whatnot. And your firm, as you said, frees lawyers from the shackles to allow them to have their own pricing structure. And that allows collaboration and transparency, which then releases them some more. I think the theme is release and freedom here today, from envy and not knowing what their comp is going to be, really, because they're in charge of it. There's a certain amount of agency and responsibility that comes with that model. And then we talked about how it allows for happiness, which is my favorite topic in the world. And satisfaction for really helping clients well. And I want to get into what you mentioned there, that you're not oriented towards associates necessarily, but to partners, and that it's really about incentivizing good behavior and collaboration, where we talked a little bit about DEI, where women and underrepresented individuals in those spaces thrive. And then at the end, in part 2, we talked about, I do the coaching in part 2, and you were so honest about the empty nest struggles and the transition with your kids being in college, and being very cognizant about not diving back into work. And you called it really a sense of grieving, which it is. Any transition where there's a shift that feels like a loss, there is that. So, and then we ended on the note that work is a component of who you are, and we all need life satisfaction. Work can never be everything, it's just a segment of who we are. So, I hope I summarized it well. If there's anything I said incorrectly, please correct me now. Otherwise, I want to jump into why we decided we wanted to do part two, besides the fact that it's fun. Anything to add? Clean up?
Uh, Maybe just elaborate on the autonomy of our model.
Yeah, we're going to dig into that.
Okay, fine. So let's dig in. That's cool.
Okay. So, yeah, really, maybe that's where you were going. My first question was, for the managing partners or the partners in the firm that were just listening, going, how do you create the right team if you're not staffing with associates that do I want to use the word majority of the billables? Probably not. Depends on what kind of firm structure has and what kind of work they're doing. But how do we create the right team between lawyers and staff? And I've got a couple of points under there because we're looking for high emotional quotient versus IQ. We're looking for EQ, but we're also looking for how we bring people in and how we retain them for growth. So that's really, I'm curious about that. So I'm sure
Sure.
there's people who are listening that are curious. I'm going to turn that over to you.
Sure. I mean, look, there's a lot that's sort of baked into our economic model, sort of the architecture of the firm, that almost by default attracts a certain type of person, a certain type of lawyer, who is more likely than not going to be entrepreneurial, the kind of lawyer who is willing to bet on herself or himself and their practice. And then also who is also by nature wanting to be collaborative. And so, when you go back to the origin story of the firm, it was really organized around the notion of let's use modern technology and cloud services as sort of our brick and mortar, if you will. So from going to brick and mortar, let's go to virtual. And one of the earliest points of the firm was that the founders were originating work and were trying to figure out who could service the work. And they tapped into New York licensed lawyers who were resident in Israel for personal, spiritual, religious, family reasons and whatnot. And so these are New York licensed lawyers. They could practice New York law. They were practicing, in a different time zone, but because we could now actually use email, use the cloud, use, video conferencing. So we're going back, like 15 years ago to around 2008. We could use this new technology as the basis for building a law firm. If you look at old original law firms, you'd build around someone's practice in a particular location, and then you build out, larger practices in the same location, maybe to other cities, and you become regional. We were dispersed from the beginning. We were distributed from the beginning. And so it kind of grew from there to attracting partners who might have wanted to have had a solo practice, but without wanting to bring on their shoulders all of the administrative burdens that come with running your own law firm. So in 2007, I started my own law firm, and I was my own IT support service, my own billing, my own intake, my own engagement letters. I'd spend 2 days a week fully on firm administrative stuff,
Yep.
Which then was less time available for either development of clients or working for clients. So when I poured over to Rimon, all of those things are taken off of my shoulders. And then you've got someone who has pretty much got a self-sustaining practice like me, who was entrepreneurial enough to leave Big Law and to go on my own, and then found a better platform to do it. And then the firm doesn't require me to bill hours. The firm just asks me to produce a certain amount of revenue. And they trust me to set the parameters with my clients and my engagements to generate that revenue.
Two
Okay, so
questions. Can I interrupt you and ask you two questions?
yes.
So you set the revenue marker, not
Well,
the
as
firm.
management, I do now. Yeah, as management as I do now. When I was a regular partner, management at the time said, "Hey, we want you to produce $500,000 worth of revenue."
I got it. Okay, that was my actual question.
Yeah,
So it's kind of a collaboration, or does management say we need you to produce 500,000? We don't care how you do it. You can bill whatever you want and just generate that income. And
we're when we're recruiting people, we're looking at people who could bring in a portable book of business today of about 650 to 700,000. Okay, in a lot of law firms, those are second and third class partners, right?
yeah, I was gonna say,
Um,
yeah.
you bring it over to Ramon, and you're running your own practice. And what we say to you is, set your own billing rates. You are the most competent person to establish the economic value proposition between you and your clients. Management in New York or DC or London who is establishing your billing rate may have no idea about your client base, may have no idea about the region in which you practice, may have no idea about the market pressures in your particular practice area, yet they're dictating to you billing rates that might be $1,500 an hour that are astronomically higher than what your client can afford. You come over to Ramon and you negotiate those rates with your client, and you are the direct determinant of how much you're going to charge your client. What I care about as management is how much you bring into the firm so that we can make sure that the costs of maintaining the firm per lawyer are covered.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
And so that's how we establish autonomy. And one of the reasons that we can do that also is because we don't carry a lot of real estate. As you know, in most big firm scenarios, real estate is a very, very heavy item of the expense side of the balance ledger, of the balance sheet ledger. And the
Yes.
other heavy item is associate salaries and associate wages. And the reason they have so many associates is because they got to pay for that real estate, and they got to have partners requiring to keep the associates busy. And so management says, I got to pay these associate salaries that are very expensive when I'm competing with, Skadden and Cravath. And then the next thing I got to do is I got to jack up partner billing rates. They've created a vicious cycle for themselves where their cost basis
Mhm.
is so high and so expensive. We, from the beginning, were distributed in remote, so we didn't have that cost basis. So we allowed the partners to establish their own rates. And a partner can come over from, I'm not going to name names, but from, an AmLaw 100 firm at which their management is requiring them to bill out at $1,500 an hour, 1750. They come to Ramon and they set a billing rate of 900, 950. They're going to make more money themselves individually. Their
Yep.
client is going to be happier, and you're going to have a happy law firm management. You've got a triple win scenario because we release. You were using the word freedom before, right? We give the lawyers the freedom to establish their own billing rates, and so that takes a certain kind of entrepreneurial mindset. A lawyer
Thank
who
you.
is
That's
willing. I was
exactly.
talking to a recruit last week, and I said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And he said, "Look at where I am in my career. I think it's time where I bet on myself. And
And
you
that's
guys are
exactly
providing the
my
platform
question.
for me where I can bet on myself."
So that you and I are simpatico because I was like, okay, you said it earlier. It takes an entrepreneurial mindset. Like if I was still practicing, I would love to practice with you guys because like I'm good at business development. I know my practice area, and let's go. Right? I would love that autonomy. How do you ensure that that happens? Because hey, I know a lot of brilliant lawyers, much like yourself, from well institutions like yours where you went, and the majority of them, because of who they are and their personality, they get attracted to law school, and then big law kind of enforces that, right? And maybe that's why they make their way to me. They're like, I have kind of numb, I've lost my sense of self, and I hate practicing anymore. So we see that trend so often. And they're good lawyers. Like they could meet your expectations and your annual production requirements. Do you find that you have to take those people and kind of convert them, or are those people never going to be the kind that would? be able to adapt and adopt the entrepreneurial mindset. Because what are we looking for? High risk, right? In a sense, because I mean, as an entrepreneur, everything is high risk, but I kind of thrive in that. I'm like, well, this is kind of fun. Who knows what'll happen today, right? Most people don't. So how do you know what to look for? And maybe get into a little bit of the weeds with us, because I think people would like to know, like, what are you looking for? And what kind of questions do you ask people? And then how do you gauge where I think you're going with this? The entrepreneurial needs to have high EQ and IQ. The IQ is a given, but because the book will show that, but the EQ is different.
Yeah, well, so what I run into is a lot of people who are intrigued by our model but are afraid, and they
Sure.
let fear drive their decision making process. And look, I don't want to judge that because I understand you might be sitting there earning a regular draw. You might be unhappy with the work you're doing, with your year-end profits or points or bonus distribution and your overall compensation, but you have security. Okay, coming to our platform necessarily means that you are going to give up that measure of security, which is why fear, feeds into certain people's decision making. Whereas on the other hand, high risk requires a certain person who is willing to emotionally assess whether fear is going to hold them back, or sit back and realize, no, I've got enough talent and I've got enough um, of a skill set and of a character to know that I'm going to be able to bring in the work, right? It's kind of like you have to shift security from the institution to yourself.
Very well said. I love that phrase. Say it one more time so people can hear.
So you have to deal with fear by not focusing on the fear and saying that the security of the law firm is what holding you down. You have to shift that sense of security from the institution to yourself. You have to bet on yourself and know that you can do this. And
And isn't
yeah, go ahead.
Isn't that the whole point? I mean, I remember after 2007, 2008, which is when I started this business, I was like, huh, we're all thinking that we're good at work as an FTE, whatever your role is, full-time employee. But there's no guarantees, right? I mean, I just heard just the other day somebody said, oh, so and so got laid off with a bunch of other, I mean, it just happened. So where is that false sense of security coming from still all these years after 2008? And I think it's to your point, is it shifting security from the institution to self, or is it, or and maybe part of it is the self-confidence that has to come with looking really internally to yourself and going, huh, what are my attributes besides being a good substantive lawyer, right? And how
Yeah,
can
being
I
a good technical lawyer is one thing, but I think there's also a false sense of security that comes into the fact that we, as lawyers, quite often come out of law school with some very, very heavy duty debt. And how are we going to satisfy that debt? Let's
Whoa.
take, in my case, it was take the best paying job that I could find, which at the time was, a first year associate in 1992, the best job, the best salary I could get in LA in Big Law was $79,000. I think Latham was
Wow.
offering 80, and I was at the firm that offered 79. I was like, okay, I don't want to go to Latham. I'll go to this other firm, um, which was Case Scholler at the time, no longer exists. And so you're sitting there, it's like, I got to write a heavy duty check every single month. And then maybe
It's
you've
real.
got a home mortgage and maybe you've got kids on top of it. And that's, look, I can sympathize with that. That can be a very scary proposition to say, okay, at least I've got a secure check. If I'm going to go bet on myself, what does that mean? How do I pay those bills? And so I'm not going to judge people for that. I just want to go back to the question of, you know, who is it that we're looking for? Because you're asking the question about EQ. And so not only are we looking at people who are willing to bet on themselves and shift the prospect of the security institution to being secure in yourself, to letting go of the fear and to having confidence. But also, one of the things that many law firm economic models do is unfortunately create internal competition. Okay.
Yes.
There are always fights at the end of the year. We're talking in January right now, January 2024. You know, PPP distributions at many law firms are going to come out in the next couple of weeks. And we're going to have in our firm a lot of recruits that are unhappy with the compensation that they just got and going to say that they were unfairly treated for whatever myriad of reasons in another law firm's economic formula. In our formula, it's very transparent. And one of the issues that's really important for our formula is that not only can you bring over your practice if you've got security, you can also grow your practice because of the collaboration that we encourage. And part of the collaboration is that we have a transparent formula in which if I ask, let's say you've got an employment lawyer and I've got a client with an employment issue that I don't handle, I can give the work to you and we have an economic model that's transparent that you'll know how much you'll get paid on working for my client, and I'll know how much I can get out of it too by referring the work to you. And so we ended up creating a community where the flow of reciprocal work accounts for 40% of firm-wide revenue and creates an transparent economic incentive for people to actually share work internally. And so you end up saying, I'm creating a model that is attractive to the entrepreneurial mindset, the person who is willing to bet on themselves. And then you marry that with the model that creates, again, economic incentive for people to actually share work and collaborate. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that that draws and attracts a certain type of person with a certain type of EQ, right? Someone who is not necessarily all about the money. They're fed up with the firm that they're at because compensation is not fair. But it's not only about the money, it's about the fairness, okay? And you come to our model where it's fair and we give you control to establish the economic value proposition between your clients. And then we give you a transparent economic model to share work in the community. So we're talking about entrepreneurial people by default who are also collaborative people by default. And so to be a collaborative person, think about what that means. That means someone who is willing to play nicely in the sandbox with others. These are people who are builders and creators. And, I'm not so big into sort of like these studies of personality types, but I like working with builders and creators, right? These are people who are energetic, collaborative, creative, and intelligent. And also, for what it's worth, highly responsible. These are people who want to do well by their partners. So if you look at Rimon historically over time, we have an exceedingly low attrition rate. People come to Rimon and they don't leave. If you're reading the news right now, there's a big spinoff from Fisher Broyles, right? This very month. They're taking half the lawyers of the firm allegedly and starting a new firm. That's a second spinoff from Fisher Broyles. And they have an economic model that is relatively similar to ours. How come we're not losing people like that?
That's
Because
a good question.
somehow we've got within our DNA the collaborative element as well. Okay.
And you think that's the missing piece. I want everyone listening to really take that in and apply it for what you know to be true as the listener. Okay. So collaboration, and I agree with you, it's people that tend to play nicely in the sandbox. Builders, creators, responsible people, energetic people. Those are the people with high EQ or higher EQ. We're always
And
working.
people, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Kathy, but also people who believe in fairness. Actually, this is the first time I'm thinking about how fairness fits into our equation, because when people are dissatisfied with their compensation at a law firm, sometimes it's people with ego who want more dollars and cents. Sometimes it's people who are like, wait, I'm not making enough money to pay my mortgage. But sometimes it's people who are like, this is not fair. I did all this work. How come I'm not being treated fairly for having done all this work? And when you come to Rimon, our model is literally transparent. So it is fair across the board. And going to the other issue that we're eventually going to get to, I think with respect to DEI and underrepresented attorneys, women, minorities, LGBTQ, we
Well,
treat you
let's
fairly. So you want to come over and thrive in our space because it's fair. It's
and
fair and
you know
necessary.
why what has got to work about that? Let's talk about the DEI
Yeah.
component. Yeah, I believe based on what you're saying, this type of person who seeks fairness as an entrepreneur and who's flexible has the capacity, from my work with lawyers and with just business people, to see themselves in the light of good enough, self-confidence wise, can see themselves as a whole, can see the things they need to work on, but the things that they're good at. And there's less ego involved in there. And as a result of that, in that environment, everyone then looks at other people and says, you don't look like me, you don't act like me, but I don't see you as a threat because I come from a mindset of um, collaboration and fairness where I honor who I am as a human being and I can self identify things that I need to work on, but things that are my attributes. And that means I can honor the distinction and differences. And then everyone has a place to belong because no one is going to look like them. And that's the beautiful part. I really think
And
that
can I
model.
can I can I pause right there? I kind of feel like I'm that kind of person, and I always felt like I was a misfit at Big Law because I wasn't interested in sort of like the butting and the clashing of heads and the internal competition. And when you're an associate at Big Law, I wanted all the associates in my first year class to be my friends, but after some point, you start looking around the table and you're like, well, no, we're not really friends. We're competitors because of the six of us on this incoming class. One of them's going to be gone next year. Three of them are going to be gone by the following year. Blah blah blah. Who's going to survive? Right? It's like the survivor game on the island. Who's left on the island?
Yeah.
How is that conducive to well-being in a career? I don't. That's horrible. But I lived it for 15 years, and I struggled immensely emotionally because there was this constant notion that unless you're always moving up, you're not good enough, and eventually you're going to have to go. And
Yeah.
that's that's a pressure cooker. That's not a good place for emotional well-being.
No, not at all. And, I coach people in Big Law, and I value the fact that Big Law brings me in for those kind of moments, right? Which end up being way longer than a moment. And it's always the same story. Yeah. But I think Big Law is slowly, hopefully waking up to that. But here's my question based on what you said. So do you find we're always looking at growth, right? Because everything is about growth. If we're not growing, we're stagnating or dying, right? And that's not good. So of course, if we want to serve more people and be of value, we need to grow. How do you find you need to motivate, provide professional development opportunities? I mean, how do you manage for growth and plan for growth around the people with this mindset? Because, that entrepreneurial mindset that's seeking fairness, we're not perfect. I can speak for myself. Like sometimes I just see things because I can tell and I'm like, oh, this is the way it should be. But, we got to, make sure that we don't get too excited about the entrepreneurial outlook on it and make sure we're reining it in. So, we have our weaknesses too, as fabulous as we are with that mindset, but how do you manage that so it's a motivator, because there's got to be flaws in that system too, right? We're just human and we're different. And then how do you plan for growth around that?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I have to admit, I have to concede that, there could be under our model the potential for complacency, right? If manager's not cracking the whip on you and saying, hey, you have to build so many hours and I'm going to jack up your rate at this price, well, then
Right.
where's the pressure come from, right? Again, entrepreneurial people more likely than not are going to be self-starters.
Yeah.
But some people could come into our community and become complacent and say, well, I'm doing well enough.
I'm
And
taking a breather.
yeah, and that's where my job as management comes in, is to reach out to those people, take their pulse, see what's going on, see whether this is working for them. And maybe it turns out that it's not working for them because there may not be as much of a self-starter behind them as they thought or as we thought when we were recruiting them. Um,
So what do you do at that point? Because
well, what I do at that point is try and say, hey, look, let me learn about you and your practice. What do you do well? What's your value add? And let me figure out if either from the marketing side, we can help you pitch and develop more work, or on the internal marketing, the community, the collaboration side, let me see if there are other attorneys who've got work and need additional bandwidth. You've got bandwidth. Let me pair you with someone who's got too much work and could use your support. And so I'm sort of, someone called me, I'm like the cruise director, right? So I'm sort of like trying to mix and match people. When new partners come into Rimon, I try to have a one-on-one orientation with them where I get to know what they do, what their practice area, what their background is, what their skill set is, and then I try and pair them up and match them with other people in the firm. And so it's really incumbent on me personally to sort of know essentially what everyone's doing. It becomes more of a challenge with 220 plus lawyers in the firm, but
spread out virtually, really.
Because otherwise, one of the problems I think that, and I'm not an insider to Fisher and Broyle, so I don't know, but one of my intuition thoughts with respect to what's happening over there is, it's kind of laissez-faire. Everyone is sort of like operating on their own as a silo. There is not an integrated community. And that's what I'm trying to do personally, is to maintain and foster the sense of community amongst our partners. We have specific events for doing that, but it's my job to sort of add the personal touch and to make sure that I'm doing that matchmaking, that cruise director for the Love Boat kind of thing,
So two questions to that. One is, how do you, I mean, look at all the things you're saying you're doing. You're not a practicing lawyer alone.
I,
You are one part therapist, one part, you have to be exceptional at reading people, reading not just the room, the people, and really assessing their ability to thrive, because they may not know it, frankly. No one's lying. They're just, it's a new way of being, right? So how do you manage your energy and your time? And the second part of that is, it sounds like it's really a trust factor of trusting the process, trusting your team, trusting the model that you guys have set up. And how do you allow for trust personally as a human being in this process?
well, so the first part of your question, look, Kati, it's exhausting. My kids said to me that I'm working a lot more now than I did when I was practicing. And I still have clients and I still have to deal with my client needs, and I still originate work. I'm still a little bit of a rainmaker. So I've still got billable hours on my plate of stuff while I'm doing these other things as well. But ultimately, the reason I do it is because I really believe in this platform. I've said to people that I feel like I'm an evangelist for Rimon because it's really a good place to be. I was never happier in my career until I got here.
Wow.
I mean, look, I was very happy as a solo practitioner, as the owner of a boutique law firm, because I was setting my own direction. And I had that confidence and entrepreneurial spirit and trust in myself. But I was doing all the administrative and the back office work, and it was hard to do all of that as well. I come to Rimon and I released myself from all of those administrative chores, and I entered a community of collaborators and like-minded people. And it was, wow, it was like spring, right? It was like fantastic. And so I really believe and trust in this model. And so that's why I do it, even though it's exhausting and I've worked harder than before. And I trust the model because I've seen it. I've seen it in my personal economic production and results. I've seen it in the collaboration and the friendships that I've made with my partners. I've seen it in sort of my own growth as a professional and as a person underneath this model. It's really, you know, it's not perfect, but it's really, really damn good. And so I took on this job because I wanted to, you know, add to that, help this grow, make it bigger, make it richer with more practice areas, with more practitioners, with more like-minded people. And so when you get to the trust, when I'm recruiting someone, or when our recruiting department is recruiting someone, one of the things that I'm always looking for is a lot of what we're talking about. And I will ask people sometimes. I asked the guy the other day, last week, the guy who said, I think it's time that I finally bet on myself. And he said that in response to the question that I asked him, which was at the end of the interview, let's talk about your clients and your practice and your business plan and your receivables and blah, blah, blah. And then his questions to me about the firm. And at the end of the interview, I said, hey, how are you feeling about this? What's your gut telling you?
Great
And he
question.
paused and he said, I like this. It's time that I bet on myself. Right?
Beautiful.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer.
It's the
I don't
perfect
know.
answer.
Sometimes I think lawyers, for whatever reason, we get into this notion that we're adversarial, and so when you're adversarial, you don't want to give away your hand, and showing emotion, unless it's anger, for example, is giving away your hand in most instances.
So
Um,
well said.
but we don't have to be. To be a good lawyer, I think being in tune with your emotions opens you up to being able to figure out what the other person's emotions are, and for what it's worth, use that to your advantage in your negotiation. Um,
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that's exactly what you're saying you're looking for when we're talking about EQ. I mean, I have a whole program called Emotional Resonance Factor. And that's one of the topics is, to be a good trial lawyer. Very easy example, right? You've got to be able to read the jury emotionally. There's
oh,
nothing else going on there. We're applying the same thing here. But fear is an easy emotion to own because it feels like we're in control. But, the truth of it is, and everyone who studies this topic knows it, underneath the anger is always fear,
oh,
right?
sure,
And
sure.
so we channel it the wrong way. And sometimes fear is necessary, right? But the adversarial nature and the fact that the law is based on precedents makes us feel like we have to be old and stuffy sometimes to feel like we're, of value because, there's old stuff behind this. And then we don't bring our best because the adversarial nature of it eats us up. So, do
Yeah.
you have two more questions for you? And then I know we'll wrap it up because you're busy and our listeners have to go. Do you have a personal practice to manage your internal your emotions and your mindset and your being? And I asked that because when we were talking last time, and I want to know how you're doing on this part too. This part two about dealing with the grief of being an empty nester and the struggles that come with that. I suggested maybe you journal or, sit still and meditate for stuff like that. And, I think it's important for people to learn how you manage your own self outside of the business and the work.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the best example of that, to be quite honest.
Well, you're doing something
I'll
that's
be
working.
brutally honest. I struggle um, with drinking, with substance abuse. I struggle with withdrawal and isolation. Um, I struggle with substituting taking care of myself by taking care of others, right? I mean, that's why I became a lawyer, I think, in the first place, in a lot of ways, is I got such a
Mhm.
high from helping others that I thought that was doing me good instead of actually doing what I needed to do to take care of myself. So I
Well,
struggle with that a lot. I think one of the things that I sort of adopted as well, okay, outside practices, there's always journal, do whatever you like. There's one thing that I like to do a lot that gives me a lot of inner peace, and that is working with the earth. That's gardening. That is my therapist used to tell me, getting back to Pachamama,
It's
um,
true. I know Pachamama.
that gives me a lot of inner peace. And one of the things that I really love about gardening is that it cultivates patience. In a culture of instant gratification, um, you don't get instant gratification working with plants. You got to let them take their time. You got to let go of control. And I
Mm.
kind of like, for what it's worth, the randomness or the chaoticness that comes with that, and just being an observer of it, but also being a cultivator of it. Um, One of the other things that I decided to do quite some time ago was to try and give up pretenses. Um,
Say
Kathy, so many times a person will be, sad or angry inside, and you run into them and say, "Hey, how's it going?" "Oh, it's great." I don't do that anymore. Someone calls me up, "Hey, how's it going?" I'll tell them how it's going, and I don't care who they are. It might be like my banker, it might be my law partner, it might be a friend, and I'll tell them, I'm okay today, or I'm great today, or you know what? Today's a really lousy day and I'm struggling inside. But that's just the way it is. Because life is not always going to be, hey, it's great. Life has its up and downs and we have to honor them. So I don't know. That's one of the things I do, is I just stop pretending that everything's great when it's not.
Well, if I could summarize that for the audience, what Juan, as I hear you saying, is that you're just being authentic and real. And I think practicing authentically comes from being vulnerable enough to just be authentic and knowing that when people say, "How are you?" maybe they're expecting a good, but if we give them the short version of, "I'm okay today, but it's kind of been a rough day, but thanks for asking." And then if they want more, they can ask. But there's a sincerity and a realness to it that we're missing. The practice of the work of being a lawyer has never been about just the substantive work. It's been about being able to bring our whole authentic self. And the more we practice that, and maybe it's an age related thing. I don't know. I'm 52. Well, I'm going to be 52 this year. I shouldn't, jump ahead so fast. But it's at some point, it's like I just don't care what others think of me. And if we could learn that sooner, right, we'd be better off. It's like here I am, and I'm doing the best I can, and I sleep well at night, knowing that I'm doing my part to be a contribution, and I have things I'm working on, and I always will. It's giving up that control, like you said, and the need to be perfect.
Yeah.
Now,
All right.
the
So, okay. So let me just harp on that for a second. One of the most damaging things I did to myself for the course of many, many years was thinking that I had to be perfect.
mm,
Um, the perfect student, the perfect son, the perfect friend, the perfect boyfriend, the perfect spouse, the perfect employee, blah, 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 blah. Um, and it almost destroyed me.
mm.
I had an episode, back a good long time ago, in which, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. And because perfection as a human being is unattainable, to the extent that we set that as an expectation for ourselves, we're setting ourselves up for guaranteed failure. You can
Constantly.
never be perfect. And if there's anyone who's listening out there who thinks, you got to be perfect in everything you do, I'd say, give yourself a break, man. Don't don't go there. Don't buy into that. Sometimes being good, sometimes being very good, sometimes being good enough. That's just enough. And be gracious with yourself. Be kind to yourself, because when you set yourself up to fail by expecting perfection, I guarantee you will fail.
Yeah, for sure. My coach shared a quote with me that I just love. I have it right here in front of me. It's be clear on where you're going, but be flexible on how you get there.
Well, you know what? That's interesting too, because one of the things that I say about, how did I become successful in my practice is I guess I realized one day that the path to success was not linear. It was incredibly circuitous. Okay.
Yes.
There were certain circumstances and events that happened in my career that were unexpected. Yet when I went and opened that door and followed that path, it created more passive opportunity for me. And So yeah, I think that's just a good metaphor for life. Be flexible in terms of where you want to get to, and also be flexible in changing the destination at times too.
True too.
Um,
True too. Yeah, absolutely. I concur, and I think people with that entrepreneurial spirit and the ability to have a higher EQ, which is all of us, we just have to choose that path. This is not
yeah,
anything that Juan and I are saying that is not capable for you as the listener if your personality type is a certain way, or if you believe in labels and call yourself an introvert versus an extrovert. I don't care. I think everyone can have a path where they exert some form of agency over their life by saying, this is how my entrepreneurial spirit shows up. And this is how I collaborate. And this is how I seek inner peace. And this is how I contribute to being part of society with my substantive knowledge. And it differs. And that's what I want us to leave the audience with, because you can be in Juan's shoes, you can be the lawyers and the partners that work with him, or you can be somebody else. But it's these questions that you ask yourself with utter ability to just say, I don't know the answers, but I'm open and authentic about it and willing to look at it in my own time, that I think um, allow you to seek your inner peace and your freedom, really. So, is there any final thoughts before I let you go and let the audience go? I mean, I honestly could talk to you for hours. I said that last time, I'll say it again, but that's just not practical. So,
yeah,
anything?
yeah. So yeah, I think one question that I did not provide a response to you on was the question of trust, right? Um, and I guess I'm personally a big believer in um, mentoring and grooming younger attorneys, and then releasing them to fulfill their potential. And I think to be able to trust someone else, to some degree, you have to trust yourself, right?
For
That you
sure.
don't have to be in control of everything. You don't have to micromanage. You've got to trust that the person that you're dealing, and of course, to be able to trust that the other person is going to be competent, again, you've got to have some pretty high EQ to be able to, assess whether that person is going to follow through with their commitments to you or to the client or whomever. But I think to be able to trust in others, you got to be able to trust yourself. Um, so, that's sort of how I approach the trust question. And I trust our model at Rimon, that we're going to be inherently attracting people with these characteristics that we were talking about before. So I just sort of offer those reflections with respect to trust. And Kathy, you know what? I think we need to have another conversation. I know you are meeting with my amazing colleague, Rhonda Grayson, later today, but I think we need to have a conversation about women in the law, DEI, representation, how that impacts representing your client, how that reflects on the manner in which you approach the practice of law. I think that's something that I would love to explore with you in some great depth.
I would love that and I would welcome that. And I know the audience would too, especially from your perspective. Um, and that's all I need to say about that. So, yes, I'm up for a part three if you are. And listeners, you have that to look forward to. And for now, I'm going to leave it where it is because I think people have a lot to noodle over. And I hope they listen over and over again and kind of jot down some of these beautiful, oh, for lack of a better word, sound bites, but they're really lessons in life. And have faith that, look, it's not just Juan that's applying this and oh, he's different and he's special. It's everyone's right to be able to take the learning and apply it to yourself, step out of your comfort zone a little bit, whatever that means, and be
Are you kidding
significant.
me? I'm certain that there's 10,000 lawyers out there right now who have this, um, let's just say, inner compass. Okay, who would do perfectly well at our firm, or could go spin off on their own and do whatever it is they want. But there's a lot of people out there. I just think that the profession is starting to slowly come around, that there are different models in which you can practice law and, wow, be satisfied personally. Think
Well
about that.
said.
Yeah.
Yeah, creative. We're getting creative as lawyers. Wow. Juan, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you for your insight, your wisdom, and your time. And I will see you again in part three. How's
Okay.
that sound?
I love
All
it.
right. Thank you. And for the audience, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Take it, do with it what you will to make your world a better place and the world at large a better place, because we certainly need it. Until next time, Katichi out.